Hello and welcome to Human Conditions, a podcast from the LRB and part of our close reading series. I'm your host, Adam Schatz, and my guest on this episode is the literary scholar and critic Brent Hayes Edwards. Brent, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm a little sad today because it's the last of our conversations, but I know it's going to be a good one. The subject of this episode is Sister Outsider, a collection of essays and speeches by Audre Lorde, a poet, novelist, and activist whose work has become, if anything, even more important and influential since her death in 1992 of cancer at the age of 58. Lorde was born in 1934, the same year as Amiri Baraka, the subject of our previous conversation. She was raised by her Caribbean immigrant parents in Harlem, and while still a child, she dropped the Y from her first name, Audre, a remarkably mature decision that she explained in her memoir, Zami. She studied at the National University in Mexico City, where she began to write poetry and embraced her lesbian identity. In the 70s, she achieved recognition as a key figure and a highly original member of the Black arts movement. She spent much of the 1980s living in Berlin, where she was the first to coin the term Afro-German. And whatever she lived, whatever she experienced, whatever differences and contradictions she felt to be a part of her identity as a Black queer woman, as a mother and activist, as a feminist and anti-racist militant, as a powerful leader, and as a woman struggling with cancer, she put into her work, which has been hugely influential among all the groups to which she belonged and in the milieu of intersectional theory. In 1980, she wrote, "I find I am constantly being encouraged to pluck out some aspect of myself and present this as the meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of self. But this is a destructive and fragmenting way to live." Her writing is fearless, both analytic and full of intense feeling, and you have the sense that she's speaking to you directly when she writes. So it feels especially appropriate that we're talking about Lorde today, a day after Michelle Obama's outstanding speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And indeed, the insistence of Michelle Obama and others on the right of people to love and live with the people they choose to love owes a great deal to Audre Lorde. Now, Brent, if we were having this conversation 2 decades ago, or even pre-Black Lives Matter, we might need to explain to our audience who Audre Lorde was. But she's such a major figure now, an icon really, that it's hardly necessary. The very fact that 2 dudes are here talking about Lorde is not insignificant, although I suspect she would have approved, because for Lorde, the subjects she addressed were of universal existential importance. So before we talk about Sister Outsider, I wonder if you might say a few words about why Lorde has become such a pivotal thinker for our time.
Her work, it continues to resonate. I also was thinking about it watching Michelle Obama, and the parts of this book, there's a piece in Sister Outsider called The Uses of Anger, that distinction, that incisive distinction that Lorde makes between hatred as a destructive force and anger as incisive critique, as constructive. Even if Michelle Obama was not name-dropping, was not citing Audre Lorde, the entire modality of her presentation and the kind of righteous indignation that she expressed with so much humor and so much power comes right from the legacy of Audre Lorde. So even if we might not notice it, it might not be at the front of our consciousness, we're walking in her footsteps. I think as someone who comes out of the debates around second wave feminism in the 1970s and 1980s, that woman of color critique, that foregrounding of sexuality and foregrounding of the complexities of difference in any political movement, the way we can't assume we're all alike, we all agree all the time. Let's confront the fact that we don't come from the same place. We don't have the same assumptions. We don't have the same upbringing. We have to confront what separates us, and that's actually the source of our strength. Those lessons, not that they're easy to learn and not that they're learned once and for all, they're lessons that you have to keep working through. But those lessons, I feel like, have shaped not just feminism, but anti-racist work. I feel the resonance of that in Black Lives Matter. If we looked at the history of Black Lives Matter as a movement, both in the US and internationally. Audre Lorde's kind of orientation and political mindset, it really has shaped the discourse of Black radicalism in a way that maybe is underappreciated.
You mentioned the incisive power of anger as opposed to hate. And, she also, of course, wrote a lot about the erotic and about love. And I wonder if those two things also tie her to James Baldwin in some ways.
Yeah, I think they do. And there's a famous conversation in the early 1980s between Baldwin and Lorde at Hampshire College. It was published in bowdlerized, in extremely excised form in Essence magazine. Apparently, they actually spoke for 5 hours, and they confronted issues around sexual identity, around homosexuality, that hardly come through in the transcript that Essence
and they also
published.
shared that experience of exile too.
Right. That's what I was about to say, that although Audre Lorde does not, like Baldwin, expatriate, really go and live in a single other country for an extended period, she does spend significant periods of time, and I was thinking about it rereading Sister Outsider, that we start in Russia and we end in Grenada. So we've got Eastern Europe and the Caribbean bookending this collection of essays. There's an international orientation in Lorde that's as present as it is in Baldwin. One thing you notice in those parts of the book is that, as with Baldwin, the discovery of what it means to be an American, to quote the title of one of Baldwin's most important mid-century essays, is predicated on the experience of exile. It's when you're not in the U.S. that you actually gain perspective on what it means to be within the U.S. And as Lorde says in the Russia essay, we're most blind to what we have. So it's when you depart, when you're at a distance, when you're not in the middle of it, that you see it more clearly. Baldwin and Lorde really share that as an orientation as well. That conversation, I hope it'll be published in its entirety at some point. What the excerpt, at least a little bit that you can read, it's interesting because you don't feel like they're quite having a conversation. You feel like they're talking on different registers, unfortunately. But what's exciting about the idea of them being in conversation is that they had so much in common.
That's a lot of hours to be talking with someone with whom you're not on the same register. But I definitely want to see that transcript. Now, Sister Outsider, I see that, like your previous selections, this book is a collection featuring pieces of different genres, including a remarkable interview with her friend, the poet Adrienne Rich. Why this book rather than Lorde's memoir or novel or her poetry, for example?
Yeah, as with a few of the selections we've discussed, we could have gone in multiple directions. And we certainly could have read Zami, her autobiomythography, as she called it, a mythologized or self-mythologizing autobiography, which is an extraordinary work in its own right that comes out a couple of years before this, in 1982, Sister Outsider coming out in 1984. And we certainly could have chosen one of her books of poetry. I think this book, Sister Outsider, has to be read with The Black Unicorn, her great volume from the end of the 1970s, from 1978. As with really everyone we've talked about, as with Du Bois and Césaire and Baraka, Audre Lorde is someone who dislodges you from your assumption of generic comfort, that we can just stick with the essay or that we can just stick with the manifesto or the political tract or the autobiography. Audre Lorde, as much as Baraka, as much as Césaire, as much as Du Bois, makes you read across genre. And I would say in the tradition of Black intellectual thought, and certainly in the tradition of Black radicalism, in the kind of radical experimentation or experimental bent of that tradition, there's an impatience with genre, that if we're going to change the world, we can't do it through one form, through one approach. You have to read across genres. You have to put poetry next to manifesto, next to autobiography. You have to read in multiple forms, and you have to write in multiple forms. So Audre Lorde, as she says in a number of the pieces in the book, in the conversation with Adrienne Rich in particular, she's primarily a poet, and she's trying to figure out, by giving these conference lectures, giving presentations, writing pieces for periodicals, by teaching, by working as a librarian, by working in the other parts of her life, how to think differently, how to think towards the revolution that that she's attempting to work toward in camaraderie with the women around her. But you can't do it in just one format. So I guess in respect of what I feel like is one of the main currents, if maybe under-recognized, of the Black radical tradition, this impatience with genre, my idea was, let's choose some works that do that.
That reflect that.
Yeah, that show us that need to think across genres. So it's kind of, we've talked about 4 books in particular, but there's a shadow bibliography under all our conversations. And with all these, you kind of need to read the rest of Lorde to get this book. You need to read Baraka's poetry, Baraka's music work, Baraka's political work all together. You need to read the full range of what Aimé Césaire or what W.E.B. Du Bois did to understand their interventions.
Yeah, you were just underscoring some of the parallels between Lorde and our previous subject, Amiri Baraka. But I wonder whether you might also talk about some of the differences. And it seems to me that one difference is that while Baraka is certainly attentive to the multiplicity of Black music, the Black radical tradition, and so forth, Lorde is much more explicit in her embrace, 1, of multiplicity and difference, and 2, in her acceptance of and praise of vulnerability, which is not something that you really find in that particular book of Baraka. You find it in the early poetry, but by the time of Black music, there's really this assertion of strength, power, defiance, unity. And this seems to me something that's very feminine, too.
It's true. And it's claimed as feminine, that vulnerability and the power that comes from that vulnerability. Because for Lorde, it's not weakness. It's not frailty. It's a strength and a commitment and a determination to speak, the transformation of silence into language and action. So it's not a vulnerability that paralyzes you, that slows you down, or that silences you. It's instead recognizing a vulnerability that propels you into the public sphere, that propels you into action. With Baraka, sometimes it feels like, although there is the self-deprecation and self-flagellation, one might even say, in the early poetry, as Baraka becomes more politically radicalized, there is a kind of public-facing Baraka that assumes, or that seems to assume, the necessity of a hard front.
Rather macho, in fact.
You could add that, to put it in colloquial terms. Yeah.
It's not entirely persuasive, because I don't think at heart he was a particularly macho man, but that's certainly the veneer.
I agree. And in the other direction with Lorde, although there's an interest in vulnerability and thinking across and respecting difference, there also is a hardness in Lorde in this interesting way, that there's this flexibility and openness and vulnerability as we're talking about, and yet there's also a fierceness, a determination that really comes through in her poetry as well as her essays.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Human Conditions, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings, or click on the link in the description.